What do you think of when you hear the term classic JRPG? Maybe you instantly think of games like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. This is, in large part, where the genre actually made its debut. The original Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and even Phantasy Star. These games released in the mid to late 1980s and really defined the most basic foundation of what a classic JRPG is. And what exactly do I mean when I say classic JRPG? Well, a lot of games are technically JRPGs. Dark Souls is technically a Japanese role-playing game. But when I say classic JRPG, I'm referring specifically to the style that originally defined the genre, including elements like a party of characters to control, turn-based menu-driven combat, gameplay that is not in first person, characters that fit specific roles in the party, such as warriors, mages, and healers, a leveling and/or stat system, oftentimes a world map / overworld with towns and dungeons on it, and usually a mostly linear way to properly progress through the game, with maybe some open-ended exploration. Obviously, something can be a JRPG without hitting on literally every single thing in this list, and there are other things that really add to the classic vibe, such as random encounters, memorable looping music. An inventory of consumable items to resource manage, etc. But the most important thing is that you understand what I'm generally talking about when I say classic JRPG. The 90s presented what a lot of JRPG fans think of as the golden age of classic JRPGs. You had games such as Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VII, Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, Dragon Quest V, Suikoden, and etc. etc. This continued on into the early to mid 2000s with blockbuster JRPG bangers like Final Fantasy X, Persona 3, and Dragon Quest VIII. During the golden age, these games weren't just high quality, they were coming out very frequently, evolving the genre, and a lot of these franchises became household names for young gamers who spent their formative years playing games like Final Fantasy VII. It really felt like these games were a massive staple of gaming at the time. We saw the evolution from Final Fantasy I in 1987 to Final Fantasy VII in 1997. 10 years later, and there had been 7 mainline releases, and the series had gone from a minimalist combat simulator without recognizable main characters to a fully 3D game with a well-realized cast, an active time battle system, and Sephiroth as a villain. Final Fantasy VII was really a cultural zeitgeist in the JRPG sphere. It even had its own movie with Advent Children, but I'm digressing. The point is that the industry was pumping out JRPG banger after JRPG banger, pushing the genre forward and creating household names that are still legendary to this day. Then, as the 2000s went on, something happened. The decline of AAA blockbuster classic JRPGs. We had Final Fantasy X, and then the next big Final Fantasy was Final Fantasy XI, an MMO. Then the next one was Final Fantasy XII, which also wasn't a classic JRPG. There were still some, like Lost Odyssey, but they really began to taper out. A lot of developers also were just putting out big games that were JRPGs, but not in the classic style. Games like Star Ocean: The Last Hope, White Knight Chronicles, Final Fantasy XIII. A lot of these games strayed so far from the original style of classic JRPGs that they weren't really recognizable to fans as what they originally fell in love with. Meanwhile, they just weren't really taking the world by storm like they used to. Instead, Western RPGs were bigger than ever at the time. With games like Skyrim and Mass Effect 2, it started to feel like things were just moving forwards, and the industry was poised to leave these classic turn-based combat games behind as a thing of the past. However, things weren't all terrible during this time. JRPGs didn't disappear, they just weren't the big AAA blockbuster cultural powerhouses that they used to be. And the biggest of those classic names, Final Fantasy, was made by Square Enix, who seemed to not be very interested in putting out a classic-style JRPG at this point. On handheld systems, though, the genre was thriving still, with amazing titles. On the PlayStation Vita, Persona 4 Golden was a smash-hit definitive version of the PS2 original. The DS and 3DS had games like Dragon Quest IX, Chrono Trigger, Radiant Historia, SMT4, etc., etc. So, hardcore JRPG fans with handhelds were playing very good classic-style JRPGs, even if the current gaming landscape was leaving them behind. Then, in 2012, or 2014 in North America, something happened. Something that gave fans who had been hoping for the return of these classic-style JRPGs in the AAA space hope. The release of Bravely Default. Bravely Default could easily be called just another great addition to the 3DS library of classic-style games. However, it was made by Square Enix. Not only that, but it was designed as a spiritual successor to the classic Final Fantasy formula. It was as if Square Enix had made a classic-style JRPG, but in the modern day. The game was also very successful, and it had fans hoping that this meant JRPGs would be having a return in the modern AAA space. And luckily for fans in North America who got the release in 2014, they wouldn't have to wait long for this to become a reality. Persona 5. In 2016 in Japan and 2017 globally, classic JRPG fans would be treated to the release of Persona 5. Persona 5 was a game that was unapologetically a classic JRPG in terms of its gameplay systems, and just like before we saw Final Fantasy go from Final Fantasy 1 to Final Fantasy 7, it felt like finally another noticeable leap had happened. We had a new AAA classic-style JRPG that was a massive hit. It sold millions of units and brought this style of game back to the forefront of gaming culture once again. It showed the gaming industry that fans were still eager for turn-based games, and it wasn't just a type of game relegated to a handheld niche. But it wasn't just a classic-style RPG, it evolved the genre and brought it forwards. It was a modern take on this classic style with modern refinements. It featured a genre-defining UI rework that reduced menuing time. It implemented systems like the Baton Pass, which allows you to switch to specific party members as a follow-up after hitting a weakness. It had detailed 3D cinematic dungeon environments. The One More combat system, which gives you additional turns for hitting enemy weaknesses. the creature collecting from SMT, even things like something like an overworld map and dungeons you enter, it kind of implements in its own stripped back and streamlined way. During the game, you can go around Tokyo, and then when you've prepared, get your team together and enter one of the palace dungeons. It was like this classic style of game was married to elements of modern game design, a truly, at the time, revolutionary and modern take on the classic style of game, which will probably be remembered as one of the most important games in JRPG history. There were other Persona games which had modicums of success, like Persona 4 and Persona 3, and even other games by the same developer, Atlus, such as Shin Megami Tensei. But none of them had ever reached the height and cultural impact of Persona 5. Persona 5 truly was the AAA blockbuster classic JRPG fans had been waiting for. Then, after Persona 5, we got Dragon Quest XI, Yakuza Like a Dragon, Shin Megami Tensei 5, Metaphor ReFantazio. Since Persona 5, we've been getting banger after banger AAA classic-style JRPG. It feels like everything is back in full swing. And as good as things are, they only keep getting better. Last year, in 2025, we saw the release of Expedition 33, a AAA classic-style JRPG that once again evolved the formula and pushed it forwards. It took ideas such as Persona 5's combat UI, real-time elements from Lost Odyssey, and even Souls-like elements in the form of bonfires and parry mechanics, and it created a new genre-defining masterpiece. It even fully brought back a traditional overworld with a boat and an airship. So, as I speak now, we've gone from the gaming industry trying to forget and move on from this classic style of JRPG. We've gone from it being relegated to low-budget niche games on handheld to now the most recent winner of the Game of the Year being a classic-style JRPG. I think we can only expect more in the future. What was a dying breed of game is now a renaissance of amazing titles. We've seen a full return and an evolution of the classic JRPG.